Good afternoon, everyone. As Jordan has mentioned, my name is Richard Kotler, and I'm a category specialist with the Central Procurement Office in the state of Tennessee. And I'm part of the technology team, which is responsible for IT procurements, and including the communications technologies, of which radios is one of them. As Jordan also said, that this will be posted later, but in addition to the posting on YouTube and so forth, the RFQ documents I am going to post to the State of Tennessee website, and I'll send Jordan some instructions so he can get that out to you. And you'll be able to get it, if you want to get your hands on the RFQ documents, you will be able to. Also, all of the contracts themselves are posted there. I'll be glad to take your questions at the end of this conference, so here I go. Let's go and start right at the very beginning, and that was, why did we do this project? Well, there's a lot of good reasons. One of them is we were dealing with contracts that were 5 years old. They had been extended numerous times. They consisted of old technology radios. So we had a lot of people out there that were buying things that were all basically obsolete when they bought them. Our customer base, they were very unhappy with the number of contracts that they had to deal with, because what we had is we had 5 contracts in place, some for portable radios, some for maintenance, some for VHF, UHF. There were, you name it, the category, and we had it. So what we did is we took those 5 contracts, which 4 of them were for radio equipment and maintenance, and 1 was for our tower build out. We looked at all of those 5, and we were able to decide that we're going to consolidate these down to 4 contracts. And there will be the radio-oriented contracts with their maintenance, and the tower contracts will stand by themselves. So that was the main reason we put this thing together. So now we have just the 1 contract to deal with. It covers 14 categories of product. It includes services. It includes extended warranties. It includes options that the equipment uses, and it includes all the accessories. And all of these are now catalogs from all the vendors, and we have 10 of those. We have, everything is multi-awarded, so for each one of the 14 categories, we have multiple award winners, so we could have competition. That was another item that was lacking in the other one. Even though there were several vendors involved in the old contracts, the vendors were associated with an exclusive product. And so if you opened up a spec, you saw it, okay, there's that vendor's name, and there's the product that he was selling us, and that's what you could buy. And no one else had that product, or even a competing product. So you could imagine a catalog of just items that had a name next to it of a vendor, and that's all you could get. So everybody was effectively sole sourced. If you wanted that product, there was only one way to go. The other thing was we were having difficulty in managing our assets. These are all capital assets radios, most of them anyhow, since they're above our $5,000 threshold. And these things all had to be grouped, options, accessories, and the basic radio. That configuration had to be documented, and then you could get an asset tag so you could track it. One of the things we focused on here in this contract series is that we wanted to be able to see if we could take out some of the time, the processing time that it took to do asset tagging, and see if there was any other efforts that were involved that we didn't need to do it at all anymore, and make that easier on the people that were dealing with the contract. So just recapping that first chart real quick, old technology, too many contracts, no real competition, and we had to manage our assets out of that. It took a lot of time. So how did we approach this? Well, sad to say, this was a problem in and of itself, and that was, how do you approach a problem where everything is as antiquated as it is and not knowing where anything is? So we started to look around, and we said, okay, maybe the best thing to do is just ask. Smart thing to do. And we went around to each one of our agencies and started asking who and what capabilities did you have internally? It turned out that several years ago, before these contracts were even created, there used to be a radio committee at the state of Tennessee that somehow or another lost its way or got disbanded and no longer was in existence. And so we looked at that and got some old names and saw if we could find anybody who's still working for the state and see if we can get some additional information from them. So we tried to find what we called our state's experts. Then we looked at it and we said, okay, can we write the specs ourselves? That was something we needed to resolve. We also looked at it from the standpoint, can we cover the life cycle of the business model needs of all the agencies? So looking at it from a life cycle perspective was a lot different than just saying, here's a number of products and parts and things of that nature and go out and buy them. So once we said that kind of a definition, and that was, the 20,000 foot level, trying to just grasp all the straws that we could find, we then looked back and said, okay, do we have any tools in our toolbox? Do we have anything that we can already lean on? So we took a look at what we had, and there were good tools in there. We had a good set of what I would call solicitation documents with a lot of forethought that had gone into it for both RFPs, RFQs, ITBs, that's invitation to bid, and some other RFX type options out there. So from a documentation point of view, we were pretty good of what we had to build on. Then we took a look and we looked at the specs. Well, as I mentioned to you, the specs were outdated. So we needed to find some way to overcome that particular condition. Now, how much internal knowledge did we have of the products that we were using? Well, we had some really good technicians out there that I was not aware of, and the people here before me were really not even aware of. And they were located throughout all the various agencies because some of our agencies did the repair and maintenance of these radios themselves. They didn't send it back to the vendors. They were working at their own depots. And so there was a good base of people there. What scared me most is most of them were ready to retire. So this was a skill set and a knowledge base that we certainly didn't want to lose, and we had to figure out a way to make use of it. We also had a number of senior managers that were out there that were in the radio business, if you will, or like they were parts of safety, part of military, parts of TEMA, and they had a number of skill sets also where they were used to dealing with radios from the broader picture of things. And then the next thing we did after talking to those people and looking and seeing what we had there was to take a look and say, is there anything external that we can lean on, and not have to go through the whole procurement process maybe. And at that time, the state of Washington, on behalf of WISCA, was putting together a radios contract, a radio equipment contract. And we said, aha, there it is. We found our savior, and we can go jump on that, and we don't have to worry too much about anything else. Well, it turned out they were going to be about 1.5 years or 2 years after we had needed it, and they were not going to cover the full spectrum of product. So we decided that we were going to just bite the bullet and do it ourselves. Now, a big factor that came up once you got that far along was, since we knew we couldn't do it just by ourselves, we had to figure out a way to get the internal trust and support, and then the external trust and support from the supply base. As to whatever it was that we were going to do, we needed them to be on board with us. What we did was we decided to take a two-step approach, and the first thing was to form a forum. Take that old radio committee and a lot of members that were there, or people that were still here, bring in new people who had oversight for radio functions and the use of radios, and establish a forum to exchange ideas, get inputs, determine what the challenges were, and to take on active role throughout the life cycle of this contract. So the first part of that two steps was the internal users group. as I was talking to you about. It's 16 agencies and departments, and they equaled about 95% of the potential and actual radio purchases and equipment purchases. The stakeholders, well, they committed to two roles, really. People at the management level that could oversee the major milestones from a holistic perspective, because, as I mentioned to you before, we left that tower contract where we're building cell sites across this state. They had insight into that, and they would have insight into the use of the equipment, so they could bring a great mindset to how to approach the issues. And secondly, they were also the people that would be able to dedicate the resources, those technicians that I spoke about and other technical people within the various areas of the agencies of the state government. They could commit them, they could keep that, make their resource available when we needed it, and that was something that was extremely useful to us, and we knew we needed that in order to gain the trust of both themselves as a group and as the supply base when we called them in. And I listed a bunch of the agencies that were involved, but this is not all. There were bits and pieces of others that were in here and out of it at various times, but these are the ones that primarily gave us the evaluators for the project and the technical support that we needed. What did the external group look like? Well, we got 13 suppliers, and we gave them a role. We asked them to help define the specifications, the terms and conditions, and even KPIs and SLAs. And I don't mind telling you that SLAs and KPIs were a little bit foreign to some of them in terms of application, and they were also foreign to the state of Tennessee in certain applications. They had never existed before in this type of an environment. So we asked them to come in, and we had a series of meetings with them. And as with most vendor meetings, the first couple of meetings were just get them to talk to each other and be comfortable in the room with each other and feel that they could speak, and we didn't have to worry about any proprietary nature of their discussions or anything like that. This was just a technical session to talk about this stuff, to talk about what kinds of specs we could develop, to talk about what kinds of categories of products we could have, to talk about a number of things that impacted them and that they could help make sure that things would be competitive as a result. And that's what the main attributes that they would be able to bring to the table. You know, a sense of really what their product does, how it's used, and what they could do relative to a spec where we could have a competitive environment, which is something that we didn't have prior to that. And here's a list of the companies that were involved in that. They were all face-to-face meetings, and it took quite a bit of time and effort and actually discussion back and forth with these vendors. I wanted to talk to you about the resolution of this thing. You know, we persevered on a methodology to develop the solicitation package, and that had to focus on resolving the most common pressing issues that both parties, the steering committee and the potential supply base, had placed on the table before us. And then we had to take that and integrate it into an output in such a way as to achieve the objectives that they themselves were putting on the table and was reached an agreement on. And there were three main objectives that came out of that. One was simplify the contracts and the management of them. The second one was enable the availability of new technology and products so we wouldn't get stuck in the life cycle we were in before. And the third one was to improve the competitive environment. Three simply stated things that meant that there was going to be a lot to discuss and a lot of work to go on by all concerned in order to make it happen. So let's go back to each one of these. Simplify the contracts and the management of them. As I mentioned to you at the beginning of this, we consolidated 4 of those contracts into one. So now we have just basically a radio, radio options, radio maintenance, radio parts, radio services, radio accessories, radio extended warranties, all of that under one contract. And the building of the towers is under a separate contract, which includes the tower maintenance. But the hardware for all that maintenance will come out of the radios contract. The second thing that we put into the contracts was the development of these KPIs. It was very nice and easy to say KPIs and SLAs, but then we actually had to sit down and figure out what they were. And the teams thought that if we were able to do this, and we had some on both sides, that we both have a stake in the ownership of the contracts that came out. So we both agreed to different things. The state agreed to things, the vendors agreed to things that could be measured on both sides. You know, one of those things was to bring the competition into fruition. We also looked at enabling the availability of the new technology and products. And that was a great concern, as I mentioned. And we have a couple of new tools that we were able to implement. And I don't know how many other states actually have these, or if we had gotten this from another state or not. I haven't been here long enough to know when we picked this thing up. But it's called a Memorandum of Understanding. And what has been worked on by our legal department, our procurement legal people, and our management team here was to be able to substitute a Memorandum of Understanding for a lengthy amendment process. Our old way of doing something was, oh, I needed to add something that I didn't think of before, and that it's a change in the technology, and I want to amend the contract, and it would take several months to do that. If you look at something in the contract that is really an extension or an evolution of it, that may have not been able to be put in there at the beginning, both parties can sign a one-page, basically, Memorandum of Understanding and insert it into the contract. So that gives us the power of keeping up with the technology. Then another thing we did, suggestion of my boss, matter of fact, was to move to a catalog-centric approach. So it minimizes the amount of memorandums of understanding, it minimizes the amount of amendments, it minimizes all the paperwork to keep up with any changes in products and what we wanted. So we started building a catalog. And that catalog now, as a result of the solicitation, there's a catalog for every single vendor. It denotes what the price of the item is, what the discounts are, when it will be delivered after order, what the accessories are for that product, and it takes you all the way through to even where you click on an icon on the right-hand side, and it will take you to the product description and a picture of the product. And that has made it much easier for our folks to be able to understand what it is that they want and how to get it, and provides a lot of flexibility. The only line items we really have in the contract today are for these services and for labor hours. Everything else is basically in a catalog. So it's made it a much cleaner approach for us to keep this contract as a good, lively contract that is always moving forward. The other thing is improving the competitive environment. We did implement a constant compete process. I don't know how many people are familiar with that, but basically every order can be competed, except in certain situations where there may be a sole source requirement, and the sole source justification would have to come into play, but I'll get into that a little bit later. As I mentioned, we have multiple suppliers for every category of product. The discount structure that's in all of the contracts are basically the minimum discount, and basically for orders less than $50,000, the agencies themselves just use a quote sheet, which we'll get into a little bit later, to be able to give that to the multitude of vendors, get bids back, add the volumes to it and go back outside, whatever it may be, and see if that's changing the price. And then if it's above $50,000, it'll come by the central procurement office, where we will take a look and see if the package is big enough to get some additional discounts, and also to take advantage of anything that we may know of or the vendor may be doing in terms of programs that they may be offering for purchases during a particular month or at the end of a quarter, or any other reason, or just the order is large enough that, the current discount structure doesn't seem reasonable. And we're very well satisfied with what's come out of the discount structure, in that we benchmark that against the everything that we could find, and we know that the minimum discount offered now is equal to or better than anything we've seen out there, so except for GSA. And so we are very much pleased with what we've gotten. I'll talk about how much cost reductions come from this thing a little bit later on. One of the other things, in addition to the multi-supplier, was the inclusion of the dealer network. Now, I'm going to get into more detail on that later, on how we included them and how we're making that work. This next chart, just to give you an idea, that the only reason I stuck it in here is to give you an idea of what the schedule looked like. It turned out that what you're looking at there is just, a made-up timeline. But at the start, we started in about March of 2014. And if you look at the first date on the top over there where it says 8/1/2014, that 5-month period was spent with our steering committees and the vendor community. That's how long that took to develop enough information and feel satisfied, both parties being satisfied, that we can now put together a solicitation package. That solicitation package took another 2.5 months, from August to October 17th, 2014. So that's how long it took us to put together the total solicitation package, get it through our legal review and comptroller and so forth, and get that posted out and there for everybody to bid on. The bid process itself took 5 months, from the time we posted it to the time we evaluated it, and the time we were able to make a selection of who the apparent winners were. Then the last couple of months were spent on signing contracts, getting them posted, getting them implemented, so they could all be effective on March the 15th of 2015. That whole period there, then, from start to contract signing, took us 14.5 months. It was, I guess, more than we thought it would take, but I think everybody felt very good that the results really, really reflected that amount of effort and the number of people that were involved in it at the time. The next series of charts that I'm going to show you are things that have to do, they're more in the weeds, a little bit more detailed, except for I won't show you the solicitation package of the contract. That'll be available later. But it's going to be what the workflow looks like on a day-to-day basis, what those KPIs and SLAs were. I'm going to talk to you about what the quote template is, and that's going to be an iChart exam. Also about generic assets and why we use them, and how our content group, technical folks, came up with them. How we are using the resellers, and what training we had done. Internal training with our agencies to make sure that everybody was on board and could use the system and understood what we were trying to accomplish and was brought into it. So here's the workflow. Now, this isn't quite the iChart it appears to be, but it does take you down to an everyday working level. Because what they're doing here is we're showing, hey, we're trying to get a purchase order, and that what we want to do is all the flow steps, looking at it from the assessment of the purchase type to whether or not it needs a sole source justification, and how does it handle if it's a non-sole source purchase order, or a requisition rather. And so this requisition process, we floated this with all the agencies and had them input it to us as to whether or not this would work, and they pointed out what would not work, and this was the result of that working together with the agencies so we could have an effective process that kept all those objectives that we had put in place to start with, would make sure that they would actually be able to work on an everyday basis. So you could see when the purchase orders are a sole source, a certain set of activities occurs, including the Central Procurement Office becoming involved. If it's greater than $50,000, the Central Procurement Office is going to be involved, whether or not it is a sole source, because those negotiations might go on from here if it's a large purchase order. So this is just a flow. If any of you want to take the time and read it and ask specific questions of it, that's fine. We'll get to that a little bit later, but I just wanted to be able to show you that there is a workflow. It happens every day. And by the way, I see about 5 requisitions a week. So, you may say that's not many, but, when you say 5 times 5, that's 250 for the year that come by. And we're buying about $5 to $7 million a year in product. The KPIs that we put into the contract. As you can see, we have 2 sets. One is the key performance indicators, and the other one is service level agreements. And this is the targets that were set. So the invoice accuracy, it's 100%. You've got the vendor's got to send us an invoice 100% correct, or we send it back. It's amazing that they want to get paid as quickly as they do, because they are definitely willing to give us an accurate invoice. Order completeness. Now what this is 98% of every single purchase order placed has to be acknowledged and shipped within 48 hours to 72 hours for off-the-shelf type items. Now, a lot of you are familiar with radios, so there's also a lot of categories of radios where the product's actually got to be built, and it might take as long as 6 weeks, and we have another set of metrics for that. For those vendors that have that type of a product, they actually have dual sets of metrics, one for standard product, one for custom product. RMA issuance. This is return material authorization. So if something comes in DOA, or there's something defective about the product that gets here, within 24 hours of the state notifying them that the product is bad, they have to have all the return information to us so we can return that product, and they automatically ship before they receive that product back. So we're already in transit. We have the new product on our way to us. The delivery performance. 90% of all deliveries, if it's off the shelf, should be done within 48 hours of the order being accepted. Reporting usage sales, subcontractor diversity, and the warranty expiration. Let me just discuss that for just a second. Relative to this reporting, what we've asked them to do is each quarter, they are to provide us with a list of all sales that are made by both the state and by whatever agency within the state, and also to local governments and entities. So we get a complete, comprehensive picture of how much business that company is doing across the state under the terms of this contract. We also ask them for wherever they have diversity subcontractors and vendors, they are to give us a report of how much they did each quarter also. So we're supporting those goals here within the state also. And in addition to that, we also have a warranty expiration report that they provide. So every quarter, each agency is getting a list of what they have purchased and the warranties that are coming due to that agency. So they can determine whether or not they want to buy a new warranty, buy an extended warranty, buy something else along, or another service agreement, or move that radio onto a larger service agreement that might encompass a whole agency instead of just the product family. And then relative to the service level agreements, the replacement and repair, 72 hours of dead on arrival product, the advanced exchange programs, which I actually covered as part of the delivery performance, and they also run a help desk where we have actually timing. So if I make a call to the help desk and it's very late in the day, the acknowledgement has to be no later than the first thing, 2 hours into the morning. The answer to the question or request can take up to 5 days, depending on what product family it is and how complex that question is. So we all have target windows for complying with the help desk support that we need over here when we are dealing with issues and problems. Okay, eye test number one. You probably can't read it, but if you can, good for you. I just got new glasses, so I'm getting used to them. But this is our quote template. Everybody uses the same template. This is prior to actually doing a requisition. This is where the information that they put onto the requisition will come from. Every vendor that they go to, so if you're doing a P25 compliant radio portable, you'll see on our overall list there'll be 5 suppliers of that particular radio or that performs a certain function to a certain set of specifications. And you'll identify the specifications up here that you want, the top half of this chart. You're identifying what you want, where it's to be delivered, the volume required, and the delivery date. That goes out to each one of the vendors in that category. They all come back and they price it out. They price out for the equipment itself, for the accessories, for anything that's optional, or any warranty that might be there. And there's also a place that I'm going to show you, and then they price it out for a total extended cost based on the quantity, and they provide that back to the agency. This next chart that I'm going to show you is actually the bottom half of this first chart. And you can see there's additional information down here, but there's also a place at the very bottom for notes. And those are for the supplier to put notes. So if we've asked for something that really doesn't exist or requires some optional thing that's really mandatory, radios tend to have some optional equipment that if you don't buy it, it doesn't work. So especially one manufacturer, not naming who names, but that gives them the opportunity to say, hey, you've missed something, or you need to include this in what you requested of me, or I can't meet your delivery window and here's why, or whatever that they want to talk back to us about, they can. And that way we're getting a full accounting of what it is they could do, how much they are going to charge for it, and going by the contract prices and the contract discounts, and then of course the extended cost, and if it's above a significant number, we will go ahead and renegotiate that for a higher level of discounts or maybe some program support. This next eye test chart is really, it's a list of each one of the categories of product. And I know I can't even read that with my glasses, but I just wanted to show it to you. It's a list of what we call our generic assets. So every single category, and I'll use the P25 portables again, that category of product has a unique identifier for which you can build your asset tagging code to. And that enables you to be able to take a lot less effort in doing your asset tagging, and also the length of time it takes to do your asset tagging. I'm going to go back 2 charts just to show you something, well, if you can see it. There's a blank space in the upper right-hand corner. It doesn't say anything because it's actually in white, but so you can't read it right now. But the vendor can, because this color scheme here is not what the vendor would actually be looking at. But what it is the agency who buys something repetitively. You know, it's the same basic radio, it's the same set of options, it's the same accessories, it's the same everything. They can create its own part number. Even though, if many of you familiar with radios will know, there's pieces and parts that are all over the whole place, and there's a million options and a million different things that you can get with them. So this allows those agencies that are very repetitive, and safety is one of them, that they can identify what the makeup is by using this alternative part number and creating the asset tag right off of that part number. Because that part down, all they have to do is have a list of the serial numbers of the items. And that's it. Everything else, they know what's in it. So I just wanted to show you that they could do that using these asset tagging categories here. You used to have an item line code for every single thing that was in there. Now you can just say P25 radio with all its options, et cetera, using the quote tag if you want to, and using the quote template rather, and going ahead and putting that up there. So this is making life a lot easier for them. Okay, third-party resellers. This turns out to be extremely important, especially for the local entities and authorized entities besides our state agencies. It's turning out that our radio purchases are about the same from the local governments as they are from the state. Some quarters it may be a little higher, some quarters a little lower, but basically it's almost the same dollar value. So there's quite a bit going on. And they all want, of course, to buy off of the state contract. Because we were going to have such an expansive contract with winding up with 10 vendors and 14 categories of products, how do you get to the local government? Well, we didn't want a contract with every single radio supply house that's in the state of Tennessee. So what we did is we asked each one of the awarded vendors who their authorized users were in the state of Tennessee, who their authorized resellers were. And they, in turn, all we did is we created something called a usage instructions, which are on our website. And anybody could look there, and they can now see for supplier A, they could see who all the authorized resellers are. And that reseller is not contracted to the state of Tennessee, but they're under contract, of course, to that vendor. And that vendor took the obligation of making sure that their resellers would cooperate using state prices and state terms and conditions for their purchases. And this is all reported back up to us. So when I said that we know what locals are buying, we know that because of all of that business is coming through the resellers. And all we did was list the resellers' names on our, what we call our usage instructions page. But they are not contracted with the state. So we included that. That took in, I don't know, another 50 suppliers really, in addition to the 10. There's at least 5 for every. There's 5 resellers at least for every single radio manufacturer that's in here. Training. That was the other thing I mentioned to you. Well, you know, none of this works unless the people who are going to use it know how to use it. And we had 2 full in-house sessions where we looked at we came up with a format for an appropriate use of a sole source, and in fact even wrote up a chart that's available, if you want to call it an authorization form that they can fill out using one of 7 different reasons for having a sole source procurement. Just checkmarked and signed off by their commissioner, and they can go right ahead and bypass almost everything else if that's the case. How to use the quote template, how to implement the constant compete process internally at their level, and also the creation and the submitting of a requisition. We took all the screenshots off of our Edison, Oracle-based platform, and gave it to them, told them how to fill it out. We had 2, complete in-house activities where we had about 8 or 10 agencies come here, and we sat down twice with them to go through these training sessions. And then we went out to 2 of the sites, military being one of them and safety being in another, where we actually did the training at their location and walked them through all the screenshots and actually did some sample runs and so forth. So that's what we did during the training session. This is a chart, and Jordan had mentioned it at the very beginning, the criteria of innovation, service, transferability, and cost reduction. So this is nothing more than just a synopsis of some of the things against each one of those evaluation criteria that we feel that this particular project has met, and met very well. On the innovative side, our steering committees, our engagement of our vendor community, how we considered our local government to make sure they were covered, and the ability to continuously update the technology. Our service level improvements for coming up with a single statewide contract instead of 4 that they had to manage before, a better way of managing their assets, establishing some KPIs and SLAs, use of this memorandum of understanding, and the training and usage instructions that we went through in order to make sure everybody knew what they had. The transferability concepts, the documents, the workflows, they're all readily available and can be provided to anybody who chooses to get them, or either through me or our website, and also the cost reduction. In addition to the manpower and amount of time now that it takes to manage the contract that was reduced, over $3 million has been saved already, and this is over and above the contract savings. These are for the additional constant compete activities and large buys. So I say thank you for listening and being patient, and if there are any questions, I'll be glad to answer them as best I can.
Thank you for that, Richard. I really appreciate it. So we'll have a question and answer time right now. If anybody would like to ask a question, you can unmute your phone by dialing *6, or you can type it into the chat box. Richard, one question we did have was around providing the templates to the participants, which Elaine actually answered and said that you all would be happy to distribute those
Absolutely.
to me. Available, yep.
Yeah, I'll make them to you, Jordan.
Sure.
I can. Actually, most of those well, that's fine. Yes, we'll provide them to you, and I'll also give you another way that people can get to them.
Okay, sure. We've had another question. What is the Tennessee website URL where this stuff is available?
That's very good. I don't know it offhand. I think Elaine is over there going to be typing it for you right now.
Okay, great. Thank you. So another question that I've had come in is,
oh, by the way, I'm sorry.
Sure, go ahead.
That person's going to ask for a URL. But once they get the URL, it's going to give them a list of the contracts, statewide contracts, and statewide contract number 418 will be all the radio contracts.
Great. Thank you. So another question that I had come into me was, now that this contract has been implemented for some time, and you've seen considerable savings, is there anything you would have done differently throughout the process, from the beginning or even to the end in implementing it?
Yes, there's a couple of things that we probably should have been a little bit better at doing, and that is we should have been not as hesitant, really, in getting the vendors involved. If we would have got, I think we were very hesitant ourselves on how to approach vendors and how to handle them, especially in a room like that. And it probably took us a month and a half or two to even get comfortable with the concept ourselves. And we're finding that to be, that's basically now just an ordinary day-to-day method of doing business today, bringing vendors in before we try and write the scope and write the T's and C's. That was one thing that was definitely it. The other thing that we knew what would happen, and this is just slowly happening, is that it takes time for competition to actually come into real being. I think every state that we looked at, including ourselves, you usually have a dominant player. And so when you want to create competition, you're going against the dominant entrenched player. And that takes time, and you got to be prepared for that. I don't think we were really prepared, but it's been slow, slower than we would have liked, but probably more realistic that we are first getting the competition now at the end of year 2, instead of right away in year 1. So if there was anything that we could have done to bring that competition on faster, we should have considered it much more than we did.
Sure. So you mentioned your hesitance to include the vendors. So once you did decide to include them, were they happy about being included? Were they excited to participate, or were they hesitant as well?
The first meeting, they were hesitant. The first meeting, they all sat around in a horseshoe and just looked at each other, basically. They didn't know what to say and what not to say. And that's where we needed to do a lot more preparation, really, to get them to engage. And we finally got it going, and a few of them became heated. So I think by the third meeting, everybody knew it was working. But
okay,
yeah, that's where we were on that.
So kind of another follow-up question to that. Someone said, you mentioned that the vendors assisted you with development of requirements. How does that work from a competition perspective?
Well, okay, there was one thing I left out, and I should have put it in there, I guess, is that we had also hired a consultant on our side to help us make sure that the specifications that were completed were broad enough that they did not prevent competition from occurring. And so, we had somebody on our side also not just listening to what they were saying and what they were proposing, but also on how to expand it, and then getting concurrence back from them that yes, that would make it broad enough for more than one person and more than one company to be bidding.
Okay, thank you. So another question, it says, as you are bringing in vendors before the RFP, are you limiting evaluation committee members' voting rights? For example, if you see them before the RFP, can you vote on their selection?
Okay, let me see if I got this right. So you're asking me the participation of our evaluators?
I'm trying to read through it as well. Let me read it again. As you are bringing in vendors before the RFP, yeah, he said yes. So are you limiting evaluation committee members? Yeah, like you said.
Evaluation committee members were not engaged at that time. They were not even selected at that time. And they turned out to not be any of the people that were in the room with the vendors. The management steering committee people, they were engaged.
Okay.
From a milestone perspective and what your major objectives should be and things of that nature, and talking about that with the holistic approach to this for the vendors. The nitty-gritty of the specifications were not, the evaluators were not participating in that. The
Okay, thank
consultant
you.
was in those meetings.
Sure. So another question, said, do you have any laws in your state that address a prohibited bidder?
Let's see, I don't know if they're really prohibited or not, but I mean, there are things like disbarred vendors. There are disbarred vendors. So yes, there are people that are prohibited. But are you talking about now in connection with the RFP? If they develop the RFP or the RFQ specs, they are prohibited from bidding? Is that what the person is alluding to, or is just general state law preventing certain class
I'm really not sure.
or debarred companies or whatever?
Okay, so she said prohibited meaning someone who assisted with the requirements.
Oh, no, we have done that. That was, I think, the first time I think that I've been engaged with it here. It is not illegal. We are doing a huge RFP right now. A fellow who sits behind me is engaged in one right now that they've had all the vendors in his category marching and trooping with him for about almost a year now. So no, there is not a prohibited. No, there isn't. Not
Okay.
something that's going to be open. Not something that you're going to keep open and competitive. It probably would be, but you know, if it was going to be, if it's deemed sole source. But we were pretty careful, and we are being pretty careful to make sure that what we're doing does not become a sole source document that is actually listed, put out for solicitation.
Right. Okay. So what volume of spend are you seeing coming from local governments?
Well, like I said, we're doing about $5 to $7 million annually at the state level, and it's almost the same thing at local and state. Local governments, the local police departments, local fire departments, first responders, so even some school systems, et cetera. So there's a lot of spend out there.
Okay. Do you have any other advice for states that might try to set up a similar type contract in their states?
Yeah, well, if you go ahead and do it, we'll be glad to share everything we've got. In addition to that, the only thing we keep kicking ourselves over is we should have added an administrative fee, because we didn't realize the local government would be that big a volume. And it could have been a revenue stream for our department.
Sure, that makes sense. I'm not seeing any more questions. If anybody wants to ask one more, we've got a couple minutes here. You can unmute your phone. If not, I'll go ahead and wrap things up. So thank you all for joining us today, and thank you, Richard, for a great presentation.